So first off, thanks everyone for taking time to come hang with us right now. Um, for those of you that are US based, I hope you had a good long weekend as well. I certainly did. And yeah, this webinar is going to be all about dynamic DAGs and Airflow, which is a topic I know a lot of people have asked for. Couple of logistical items as usual, and then we can kind of dive right into this good stuff. So first off, all of the content that we're creating here, the video as well as the code we'll walk through, will be sent out to your inbox afterwards. So no worries about that side of things. And then second off, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A section, and we'll either get to them during the presentation, or if they're a little off topic for what we're talking about, we'll be sure to answer them afterwards. Yeah, I think that with that said, I'll hand it over to Kenton, who will take the show from here.
Yeah, thanks, Raj. I'll echo that. Thanks everybody for joining. We're excited to have you here. Our guide on dynamically generating DAGs is one of our most popular ones, so I understand it's a topic that the community has a lot of interest in. So we're excited to kind of dive into that deeper today. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. This over. So just kind of some housekeeping, a bit of an agenda first. So I'm going to run through some slides at the beginning that'll talk about what are dynamic DAGs, when you might want to use them, as well as a couple of methods that we've seen commonly used for creating them. We'll talk about some drawbacks as well. So they're not kind of a perfect solution in certain cases, so we'll dive into that. And then finally, I'll go through some example code to kind of highlight these topics in more depth. So like Raj said, we'll leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A. Feel free to throw those questions in the chat at any point throughout. So to start with some context, I want to actually talk about generating DAGs statically. So if you've been using Airflow before, this might be a method that you're familiar with. It's probably the most common, where you might have a single Python file for each DAG. Within that Python file, you instantiate your DAG and then define your tasks, something like this example here on the right. Another way of describing this method is to say that every time your DAG file is parsed, you're going to create the same exact DAG. So kind of with that in mind, I want to back up a bit and then talk about what actually makes a DAG. So again, if you're newer to Airflow or if you've been using it, that's the static method that I just showed is oftentimes what is used and presented. But that's not necessarily needed in order to create a DAG. So Airflow will execute all Python code in your DAG folder as long as that code contains the word DAG or the word Airflow. From there, it's going to load any DAG object that's found in globals. So this means that any Python code that generates a DAG object can be used to generate your DAG. So you don't necessarily have to have a static file. So for example, that could be something, on the left as an example of the static definition where you're calling that DAG specifically. On the right is an example of a function that creates a DAG object. So this is something that you could call then dynamically to create DAGs in a dynamic manner. So just to kind of summarize that, when we talk about dynamically generating DAGs, we're talking about DAGs that are created when each parsing of that DAG file could create different results. So that may be from the result of like a loop or an external file read or something like that that's happening in your Python script in addition to just generating the DAG itself. So when would you want to generate DAGs this way? Dynamically generating DAGs can be really helpful, especially if you have DAGs that follow a similar pattern. So that's kind of the key that we'll call out as a time where you might want to do this. It can also help if you are automating a migration from a legacy system to Airflow, especially if you have some number of DAGs that is inconvenient to write each of those files. Maybe you have DAGs that are exactly the same, but only have a parameter that changes between them. So DAGs that are like loading data into tables in a data warehouse, and you have a lot of those tables, but otherwise the DAGs do the same thing. You might have DAGs that are dependent on the changing structure of like a source system. So maybe you have a set of DAGs that are refreshing materialized views in your data warehouse, and you don't necessarily know when or how many of those materialized views there are going to be. And you don't want to manually create a new DAG file when a new one comes up, something like that. This can also be used to kind of institute standards within your DAGs across your team or organization. So if you want the base structure of your DAGs and some of the default arguments and things like that to be standardized, dynamically generating DAGs can be a good way of doing that. So from there, again, I'll dive into kind of a couple of different methods that we've seen used to dynamically generate DAGs. So I'll note here that this isn't meant to be comprehensive. There are many ways that you could write code of all different sorts to generate DAG objects. There's no right or wrong answer. So rather, we just want to give some examples of ways that we have seen this implemented successfully that are kind of the low-hanging fruit for if you think that dynamically generating DAGs might be good for your situation. These are methods that you might want to look into first. So the first one, and probably the most straightforward, is using a single file to dynamically create all of your DAGs. This would be like a Python script that lives in your DAG folder and generates the DAG objects. So you might have a function that creates your DAG based on some parameters, and that, like as shown here. And then you might loop through that function call for some set of parameters. So we'll walk through this in more detail, kind of what that looks like. But this method is particularly useful since you can have those parameters come from any number of different places. So that might be within the file itself. It could be an Airflow variable, Airflow connections. It might be some external source entirely. So you're getting it from a database or something like that. Super flexible there. The other method we'll talk about that's a little bit different is creating actual multiple files dynamically for your DAGs. So rather than having a single script that is going to create all of your DAGs for you, this would be generating some sort of script. So that could be Python, it could be another language that will actually create Python files for you. So essentially you're dynamically creating what will eventually be static DAG files that are then loaded into your Airflow environment. So this can be really straightforward if you are parameterizing the same DAG structure and you want to just read in those parameters from like a YAML or a JSON file or something like that. We'll walk through, again, an example of that in more detail in just a bit. Before that, I'll kind of dive into some of the pros and cons of both of those methods. So having a single file that can generate your DAGs for you is, like I said, easy to implement and can accommodate input parameters from multiple sources. So it's super flexible. You'll also see any newly added DAGs almost instantaneously in your Airflow environment if you're changing those source parameters. So that can be useful there as well. The cons to this method are that the visibility into your DAG code is limited, and I'll show an example of kind of what that looks like. And it's also not as scalable. So this can be a really good option if you have kind of a limited number of DAGs. But we've seen people run into issues, when trying to scale this out, especially if you have like hundreds or thousands of DAGs, and highly dependent on kind of your environment, but something to keep in mind with that. On the other hand, generating multiple files, so actually, again, creating those Python files, pros are it gives you full visibility into your DAG code. So the end result is just as if you had static files, you're just dynamically creating them in the background. So your experience once you get to the Airflow UI is going to be the same as it would be if you were writing all of the files manually yourself. And it's also more scalable. So I'll talk about that more a little bit in a minute. On the other hand, the cons to this method are it can be complex to set up. So we'll see kind of what it takes just for a really simple example. But it's going to be a lot more work up front, depending on how complicated your use case is. And then in this method, if you want to add new DAGs, that probably requires configuring a deployment or some other way of running that script that's going to create those DAG files. So depending on how often you expect your DAGs to change, this may or may not be convenient for what you're looking to do. So from there, I want to talk a little bit more about scalability. So I've touched on this a bit already, but to back up on why I say there might be scalability issues for the method using a single file to create all of your DAGs. The reason for this is that any code in your DAG folder is going to be executed on every scheduler heartbeat. So that's pretty frequently. So methods where that code in that folder is dynamically generating your DAGs are more likely to cause performance issues at scale. You especially want to be careful if you are making any function calls in that file to like external systems, because that's going to happen all the time. So if you're trying to hit a database to get, a set of tables that you're going to parameterize your DAGs based on, or like an API endpoint, that can be really problematic if that's happening, once every couple of seconds. A good benchmark to look out for is if your DAG parsing time ends up being larger than the scheduler heartbeat interval, then your scheduler is going to get locked up and your tasks won't be executed. So if you have dynamically generated DAGs in this manner and you notice that none of your tasks are getting scheduled, this can be a good thing to look at. There are some ways around this, and it's can be kind of parameterized and configured at the Airflow level to get this to work. Airflow 2.0 is really helpful for this, since the new highly available scheduler, you can run multiple scheduler replicas to sort of spread out that load. So there are some things you can do there, but again, in general, if you're looking at thousands and thousands of tasks from these dynamically generated DAGs, you might run into issues here. So there's no one right answer. It's kind of more of an art than a science, trying to figure it out, but something to keep in mind. And then finally, before I jump into some examples, I also just want to touch on some tools that are out there in the community. So if you've already been using Airflow or heard a sort of astronomer talk about Airflow, you'll know that one of the great benefits is that it does have this really robust and active community, and people are always contributing things back to the community to make different use cases easier to implement. Dynamically creating DAGs is definitely one of those. So there is a tool out there called DAG Factory that is meant for dynamically generating DAGs from YAML files. It's an interesting one to look at. I've seen folks be successful in using it themselves. Certainly not the only tool out there. So just wanted to note that if you're looking to get started with this and you're kind of lost and you don't exactly know where to start, spend some time kind of looking at what's out there that's already been built, because some of it's really effective.
We get some quick question from the chat here around this process. Great timing, actually, as the question was around reading configurations from YAML or JSON type files to dynamically generate your DAGs. Do you have to worry about the same things from a performance perspective if that's what you're doing?
It depends on how you're doing it. So we'll kind of walk through a couple of different examples. If you're reading configurations from YAML or JSON to create a static Python file, so you're actually generating that DAG file itself, then you won't run into the same performance issues, because with that method, at the end of the day, you're essentially getting to the same place as you would by manually creating those files, and your file is going to be static. So every time your scheduler parses it, it's just getting the same DAG definition, as opposed to having to do a lot of processing to create all of the DAGs. It's also possible to use YAML configs with a single file script that's going to dynamically generate your DAG. So in that case, you might have those performance issues. So kind of depends on your implementation. Good question. So from there, I'll move on and actually jump into some of these examples. So I'm going to hop over to code editor here first. And again, so I'll talk through kind of both methods. These are pretty straightforward implementations, but again, just some ideas to kind of get you started. So the first is going to be that single file method. So I want to create a file that's going to dynamically create a set of DAGs through some sort of loop or external, function call or something like that. Just as a note, for what we're looking at here, I'm using an Astronomer CLI project to run this Airflow instance locally. So all of my DAGs are in this DAGs folder. So this is equivalent to the DAG underscore folder that I talked about earlier. So Airflow is going to parse all of the code in this folder on every scheduler heartbeat to look for DAGs. So within here, this is kind of the first simple one for creating, again, multiple DAGs from a single file. So what I do with this is I have this function that is going to return a DAG object. I obviously have it parameterized for a couple of inputs. And within it, it's just, I define another Python function. So I have a simple Python operator, hello world, that is going to take some input and print it out. From there, the rest of this script is again going to loop through a range that I provide. And for each one of those, it's going to call that function and create a new DAG. You'll notice again that I'm calling this within globals here so that Airflow recognizes it as a DAG. But from there, all I have to do is call that function a couple of times, and Airflow is going to parse through all of this and recognize each one of those as a different DAG. One thing I'll note here is that you want to be careful when doing this, that you make sure to write your function in a way that gives each DAG a unique name, because otherwise you will end up with only a single DAG, even though you looped through multiple times. So that's why we dynamically create the DAG ID here. So if I hop from there, go over to Airflow, I have Airflow running locally here. You'll see that I have these 4 loop hello world DAGs. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 that correspond to the loop that I was creating before. If I pop back to the code here and I say change this to 6, go ahead and save that file. And I pop back over to Airflow and go ahead and refresh. You can see that that new DAG for number 5 has now popped up. So this was one of the benefits I talked about. This method, obviously you're going to get an instantaneous response when you make changes to whatever input parameters you're creating your DAGs based on. So that can be a benefit there.
Quick question from the chat here from Andrew. Can you use a similar technique to generate dynamic tasks in a DAG instead of just a dynamic set of DAGs?
Yeah, absolutely. Dynamically generating tasks is probably even easier. And we do that a lot. I don't think I have an example here, but we could certainly send one out afterwards. One really common way is to just do that in a for loop, like you would see here. We have an example DAG that loops through API endpoints to get COVID data from multiple states, and we do that dynamically. So again, you could do it in a similar manner. Really, the short answer to my long-winded answer for this question is that because everything within Airflow is written in Python, you really have the full power of Python behind you. So you can absolutely dynamically generate those tasks here, and it's going to show up in your DAG. Good question. So one other thing I'll point out about this method, I talked about one of the drawbacks being that you have less visibility into the code. Part of the reason I say that is so if I look at one of these examples and then I look at the code in Airflow, you're just going to see the code for the file that generates this DAG. So this is obviously not just the DAG object that is being returned by this function. It's the entire file. So in this particular case, obviously it doesn't really matter very much since this is just a simple Python function. It's easy to figure out what's going on here. But if you have a more complicated use case and you have parameters coming in that are more complex or potentially from multiple sources, this can be a bit of a drawback for folks that maybe are looking at the Airflow UI and trying to figure out what's going on with a particular DAG and don't necessarily know, maybe they weren't the ones that built it. So that can be a bit challenging if you're trying to figure out what any particular DAG is doing. So from there, I'm going to pop back over here and look at this dynamic DAGs variable option. So as I mentioned before, with this method, one of the great things about it is that you can parameterize those DAGs in whatever way makes sense for you. So obviously, us, defining a for loop like this with a range is probably not going to be a real world use case for anybody. I would at least assume, although I guess if that was your use case, that's cool. It's pretty easy. So instead, you're probably going to be pulling those parameters from elsewhere. So again, maybe that's your database, but there's really no limit to where you can get those DAG or the parameters from. Another example that we show in this script is getting those parameters from an Airflow variable, so an environment variable in your Airflow system. That's what's happening here, where again, in this case, the variable that I'm pulling is just the number of DAGs. But this is using Airflow's variable function to get this DAG number, and then converting it to an integer just in case, and then looping through it similarly down here. I pop back to my Airflow environment here and go to admin and variables. You can see I have this DAG number defined. It's currently set to 4. And then I pop back to my homepage. You can see that I have these variable hello world DAGs. Couple of things to note here. One part of the reason that you see 1 through 5 here instead of what should actually be, I think, 1 through 3, based on how I have that code, because with dynamically generating DAGs, kind of a quirk in Airflow is that if the DAG is removed kind of on the back end, it will still show up here in the UI unless you delete it right now. So that can be a little bit confusing for folks. Obviously, if I add a new one, it will pop up instantaneously. But if I take one away, you might still see the DAG in the UI here. So that's why you see those. Another thing that I'll note here is that I mentioned, probably if you're generating DAGs in this way, you're going to be pulling that parameter for parameters from some external system. And you don't really want to do that in your DAG file. Because again, you don't want to be hitting your database every couple of seconds or an API every couple of seconds. You're going to hit like request limits or something like that. So one way that I've seen folks work around this is by having a separate DAG that creates like an Airflow variable based on that whatever that external system. So if you wanted to implement having DAGs that load multiple tables in your data warehouse, and you don't necessarily know what those tables are going to be, but it's dependent on your source system, you might have a separate DAG that goes and looks at that source system, says what are the tables that need to be loaded, and then write that information to an Airflow variable. Maybe that can run, every day or every hour or however often makes sense for your use case so that it's updating something here. And then you can have your dynamically generated DAGs pull from this information so that you're not hitting your database all the time. That's going to help with scalability and performance issues. Kind of a workaround as a way of doing that. We have another, Raj, were you gonna ask me a question?
Yeah, you saw me come off.
Go ahead.
So really just, I think what was really interesting here is just the different ways you can parameterize those DAGs. So you showed a couple of static methods to do it, right? You're doing it from a list, or you're doing it from, something you're defining. Can I use CI/CD or something external to Airflow to help parameterize those DAGs? One more time, to help parameterize those DAGs?
Yeah, definitely. So that could be, yeah, there's a couple of ways I could see doing that. One would be kind of what I just described, where you're using that tool. So maybe that's your CI/CD tool to update like a variable or a connection or something in Airflow that then your DAGs are using dynamically. The other way you can do that, that I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, is if you're actually creating those DAG files, you can have a script that does that parameterization and updates those files, and that could definitely be run as part of your CI/CD process.
Perfect. I hope that answers the question. It was asked by Anonymous, but there's a follow-on question there that's around, like, when you're parameterizing those DAGs, do you have to kind of take extra steps to make sure that the names are going to be unique, or are you going to have conflicts?
Yeah, so you definitely want to make sure that you are doing this in a way that all of your DAGs have unique names. If I were to say comment, so this is where I create my DAG ID that gets passed in for the DAG name. You can see it's parameterized here, so it's taking in that number. If I were to comment this out and not have this line, what you would end up with is one DAG that was named whatever the last thing this looped through. Because if you have DAGs with the same name, Airflow is not going to know that they're different. So you definitely want to make sure that however you're doing this, that your DAG ID is always parameterized in some way, or you have some other method for making sure that it's unique.
Perfect.
Yeah. Good question. So yeah, again, for this method, there's really kind of no limit to number of ways that you could parameterize this. As Viraj said, it's super flexible. We have another example in the repo. I won't go through this one in too much depth, but this one is getting the parameters based on Airflow connections. So that can be especially helpful if you have like multiple databases that you're trying to parameterize based on, something like that. But again, there's tons of different options there kind of for whatever your use case is going to be.
And when you're doing these approaches, do you have to worry about the amount of load you're putting on the Airflow scheduler, since you still are making a database call to get that connection name or variable or whatever?
Yeah, absolutely you do. So that's kind of falls into the scalability challenges that we talked about earlier. Anytime that you're, the code in your DAGs folder is doing a lot of processing that might take some time, that's potentially going to be problematic because it's going to happen on every scheduler heartbeat. So again, some of that can be managed by your Airflow config, and kind of how you set up your Airflow environment. Some of it might be managed by how you actually do this dynamic generation. So like I said, if you are hitting like a database to get that information, I would definitely recommend having like a separate DAG that did that and then saving that information as like an Airflow variable or connection or something like that, so that you don't want to be hitting like an external system every time your scheduler heartbeats. That's just not going to go well for Airflow or probably your external system. So yeah, it's really about just kind of how you design that dynamic generation in a way that makes sense. And it is entirely possible that you would be working at a scale where this might not work very well. Again, we've seen it work for lots of people, but sometimes there are limits and you have to kind of work around those. Yeah. So I think that's a good segue into talking about kind of the next method, which gets around a lot of that scalability issues, and that would be sort of multiple files. So again, in this case, rather than having a script that creates my DAGs that Airflow is parsing through, I would set up some code infrastructure to actually create Python files that then are uploaded to my Airflow environment. So the end result of this method is going to be the same as if you had manually created the DAG files. So you don't have those same scheduler issues because the code needed to create the DAGs is probably being run elsewhere. So as an example of that, in this environment, I have in my include directory a couple of things. So I have a DAG template.py, and I have a generate DAG files.py. And then I have this DAG config folder. So what I've done here as an example is this DAG template is creating exactly like what it sounds like, a template for a DAG. And I mentioned earlier that these methods work really well in general if you have DAGs that follow like a particular pattern. So obviously in this particular case, I'm showing a DAG that has a Postgres operator that just runs a simple Postgres query given a connection and schedule. So this might be something that would work really well if you had like a team of analysts that are scheduling SQL queries like against a database, and maybe they don't know a lot of Python or don't want to deal with Airflow, or maybe you just want to standardize things kind of as the Airflow admin, and so you created a template like this so that anybody can come in and add a config file to schedule a query. So the way this works is, again, I have this template that defines my DAG, DAG ID, and the schedule, and then the query. You'll notice I have these set as specific strings. Then I have this generate DAG files script. This is going to, again, pretty straightforward, loop through any configs. So I'm going to give it a config path, and then my DAG template file name. And it's going to loop through any config in my config folder and take the information from the config and then replace or put that into my DAG template and create another file. So as an example, what I have in this DAG config is I'm passing in a DAG ID, a schedule, and then a query. So in this case, I have DAG file 1, I'm scheduling it daily, querying it just from table 1. Within my DAG template, that information is going to get put in for my DAG ID, the schedule I'm replacing, and the query I'm replacing. I then have another config file that's going to do something similar, but you can see this one has a different DAG ID and a different query. If I run this script that generates my DAG files, you can see that that's going to put them into my DAGs folder with a new name. So I ran this earlier, and you can see here I now have this DAG file 1 and this DAG file 2. Within DAG file 1, if we look at this, it's going to look exactly like the config file did, except for that you can see the DAG ID has changed, my schedule has changed, and my SQL is now what I put in that config file. These DAGs will then be uploaded to my Airflow environment. So if I look at them in the Airflow UI, they're going to look just like any other static DAG would. So still going to have my DAG information here. If I look at the code, it's going to be the code specific to this DAG. So I have full visibility into it. Some kind of benefit there. I'll note that with this method, so again, this can work really, really well, especially in cases like this, where this is a real world example that we've heard of people having where they just want to give their analysts sort of power to schedule queries without having them need to learn Airflow and can deal with the Python. I've also heard that it can be a useful way, again, I mentioned this earlier, to sort of institute standards across your DAGs. So I don't have this in this example, obviously, but maybe I want to say, all of my DAGs across my organization need to have 2 retries for every task, or they need to have a certain alerting mechanism for failures, things like that. Having a template like this can be an easy way to institute that, because the people actually working on creating the DAGs are then not dealing with all of the DAG files and the default arguments and all of that stuff. They're just creating these configs. So that can be really useful there. Kind of one of the drawbacks to this is obviously you can see that this took, not very much work, but I have a couple of different files here. I had to write a script to replace these lines. If this were going to be a more complicated use case where maybe not every DAG has the exact same single task, or maybe there are a lot more things that might be changing, you can imagine that it could get more complex. So it can be more work to set up front. But again, the benefit here is that you still don't have to manually create those DAG files. You can parameterize based on external information, but you have full visibility into the code. You end up with an actual Python file for your DAG, and you don't necessarily have to deal with the same scalability issues. In terms of actually executing this code, that's where the CI/CD could come in a lot of cases. That's a good way of doing that. If you have somebody add a new config file, maybe push that up to your repository, and then your CI/CD takes care of running the script, which then generates your DAGs, pushes them up to your Airflow environment. Obviously, lots of different ways that you could implement that, but that's one way that we've heard about from some of our customers that's been pretty successful for them.
I think the CI/CD approach to that makes things really, really dynamic, because then you can really give your users the guardrails that they need, but also the freedom that they want to do what they need to do.
Yeah, definitely.
Kenton, I know we have about 15 minutes here. I'm just going to warn you a little bit. We have a ton of questions piling up in the Q&A, so.
That's perfect. I was just about to say that was all I wanted to show for right now, so we can go ahead and dive into that Q&A.
Awesome, cool. So I'll start feeding these to you, and then we can just kind of go from there. So question from Anonymous. Can we generate a dynamic DAG with Jinja templating like we have with the other techniques?
Yes. The short answer is yes, you absolutely can. I don't have an example of that, but that is a great way in general to kind of parameterize your DAGs, and it could work instead of the method that I've done here, where I'm replacing the keywords within the file. You could do this instead via Jinja templating.
Perfect. And like all things, if that's something that you need a little more help with, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll definitely be able to help out. Cool. So question from Arnie here. I hope I pronounced that right. What would be your suggestion if you want to create a new DAG often, but the code itself only changes slightly? Would it be possible to trigger the DAG after a short time it was created? Is this something that would go better with the multiple file approach or the single file approach?
So that's a good question. I would say I think that would be easier to implement with the single file that we talked about, because you have in that case sort of more static code, but instantaneous sort of updates based on some source system. So if you have your DAG changing a lot, that's a good way to implement that. Again, it kind of depends on the scale. So at some point that method, might run into problems, but if this is at a fairly small scale, then I would say that seems like it would be a good starting point. It's also just a pretty easy way to get started, right? So that's going to be easier than trying to create the infrastructure to create the Python files this way. So I would probably recommend starting with that and then seeing if it kind of worked at the scale and for your Airflow environment.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that answer. Definitely starting with a single file is the right way to go. And then from there, you can always optimize. We'll jump into the next one. Oh, here's a good question. Like when I'm doing this, what's the safest way to handle things like credential management inside my DAGs? Is that something I should prioritize out, or is there any other technique that I can use there?
Yeah, good question. So one way of doing that is to have like using Airflow connections. So in this particular case, I'm not like passing in information for this connection ID, but you easily could. So have that be part of what you're parameterizing. It kind of depends on your DAG and what it's doing. If you're, we would always recommend using like Airflow connections to connect to external source systems if you can. So that's an easy way of doing that, is parameterizing that. Especially if it's changing like for each DAG, and you can't do something like have your Airflow environment assume a role that then has access to those external services or something like that.
Yeah. I think the other thing you could probably do is use tools like Vault as your secrets backend, to make it so that maybe each DAG is only referring to a certain place in Vault for the credentials. So you can kind of work around the Airflow piece of that entirely.
Yeah, definitely. From a DAG perspective, that will look not really any different probably than what this looks like. You can just set up your secrets backend so that you're not managing it through an Airflow connection. We see a lot of folks do that in production with static or dynamic DAGs, right? That's always a good idea.
Yeah, it's almost like a general best practice there. So question from Joe here, Joe Merton. What about source control? Do you think that each DAG that you generate should be checked into source control, or should it just be the config files, or should it be both?
So in the case of multiple files where I'm actually generating the Python files that are being uploaded to Airflow, I would recommend checking those into source control, just because it's going to give you the record of them. And if you're like changing, the template or something like that, then you still have that historical record of the older files, even if they're not being sent to Airflow. I guess you'd have to be a little careful in that scenario of what, having your CI/CD tool actually manage which DAGs are getting sent to Airflow and making sure that they're always the new versions. But I think in general, my recommendation is always like put everything in source control, because I think it's just safer.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head, I can't think of a situation where you wouldn't want to do that.
Exactly, right? It's like pipelines as code. Code belongs in source control.
Yeah. Exactly.
So two-part question here over a use case I think is pretty cool. This one's again from Anonymous, but is it possible to use this technique in combination with a trigger DAG run operator? E.g., I'm trying to replicate sub-DAG functionality. So I want a DAG that generates other DAGs, triggers them, and if those quote-unquote sub-DAGs fail, it can retry the whole sub-DAG contained in the trigger DAG run operator.
Yeah, I think you could definitely do that. I don't see why not. That sounds like a really interesting way of working around sub-DAGs, which we're always happy to hear about. And yeah, I don't see anything that would be wrong with doing that.
So then follow-up question from me there is, could you just take out sub-DAGs entirely there and just use task groups if it's all you're looking to do is manage those dependencies?
Yeah, I think it depends on kind of what the purpose of the sub-DAGs were, whether or not you decide to do that with task groups or triggering separate DAGs. If you have, if it's more of just an organizational piece, then the task group I think is the easier way forward, and you could absolutely dynamically generate DAGs that have task groups, or even dynamically generate the task groups themselves. We have a guide that covers how to do that, which is kind of cool. If you're using sub-DAGs more because you have DAG dependencies between sort of different sets of code that needs to be rerun based on kind of different criteria, which it sounds like maybe this use case was. I think using like trigger DAG run operator and actually having different DAGs might be an easier way there, kind of a more intuitive one. And also note that with Airflow 2.1, there's a new view for cross DAG dependencies in the Airflow UI, which is a really helpful way of visualizing that. So that could be a cool thing to look into.
Yeah, yeah, I love that view. I think that would make use case like this, everything would almost feel like one DAG then.
Yeah.
Awesome. So another question here is it possible for Airflow scan DAGs from a database instead of a DAGs directory?
So not currently, I believe is the answer. And I'm always I'm the wrong person to ask for the terminology as to why that's the case, but I know that you can't like currently pickle DAG objects or get them from elsewhere. And I think that has to do with the kind of internal workings of Airflow.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of AIPs around the general idea for that, but for now, we really need to the scheduler needs to read the DAG file directly from the file from the directory. Sorry, yeah. Getting my words on.
From the DAG folder.
From the DAGs folder. There we go. Cool. Question from the YouTube chat, which we're getting fed in from the other side here, is if I have 1,000 simple workflows, right? So what if my workflow is just a couple of SSH and HTTP calls? Is it better to go with 1,000 DAG file or dynamically generate 1,000 DAGs?
Was that so having like a single DAG with 1,000 tasks, or generate a DAG for each individual task?
Yeah, or even maybe even a single file that generates a bunch of DAGs there.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I think it kind of depends. I would say, yeah, it kind of depends on how related the tasks are and what else might be different about them. So if they're running on the same schedule, if you always want to run all of them together, etc., sometimes it can be simpler to have everything in the same DAG and dynamically generate those tasks. If there are differences in, again, like the schedule is one that comes up a lot because you can't have multiple tasks in the same DAG run on different schedules, right? If you don't want to run them at the same time, then they're going to need to be different DAGs, and that could be a good method for dynamically generating them.
Yeah, definitely big. It depends there. There's like so many ways you could do each thing. But I think the most important thing here is that give it a shot, right? Start somewhere and then kind of build up from there. And of course, whoever asked that, if you need some help, feel free to shoot us an email. We'll definitely be able to help you out there. So we have about 5 minutes left, and there's still a bunch of questions. So I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but we're going to do our best. So another question from, let's see here, from Eric Wolf. I hope I pronounced that right. How do you measure the impact of dynamic DAGs on your Airflow instance? Like how do you know when your things are getting bottlenecked?
Yeah, so this is one where there's no single answer to this. And again, it's kind of more of an art than a science. One thing to definitely look out for if your scale is big is, again, if the time required for Airflow to parse everything in your DAGs folder ends up being bigger than your scheduler heartbeat, your scheduler is going to lock up, and that's probably going to result in tasks not getting scheduled. So one really good thing to look for is if your tasks are getting stuck in like a queued state or even a scheduled state and they're not actually getting run and you're dynamically generating a lot of DAGs, that can be a good indication of, okay, you have a problem. Other things to look for are just kind of general scheduler performance. So making sure that your heartbeat looks normal, reviewing kind of your task latency over time. If it looks abnormal in any way, can be a good way of checking for that. Again, there's no exact kind of numbers on what is going to cause problems and what's not. It depends a lot on what the DAGs are and kind of what your Airflow infrastructure looks like.
Yeah, yeah. Just adding my 2 cents on that. Like if I start seeing delays in my task execution, especially with Airflow 2, that tells me something I'm doing is wrong. It could be in the way I'm generating my DAGs, it could be in my operators themselves. I'm not, there's 1,000 places that could be, but that to me is always a telltale sign that, hey, something I'm doing is wrong. I should kind of rethink my design patterns I'm following here. Awesome. So another question from Joe Merton here. Any good articles on CI/CD for Airflow?
Yeah, yes. We have so a couple of things that come to mind. We have some documentation just on using CI/CD astronomer that's also, I think, applicable to Airflow in general. We also have a guide that we just published at the end of last week that I wrote on testing within Airflow that talks a lot about using CI/CD to, in that particular case, to like run tests on your DAGs, but it's also applicable kind of in a more general sense. And it has some links out to other kind of more general CI/CD documentation if that's something you're newer to. So that could be a good place to start.
That's definitely a good place to start. I asked that to you up there because when you say we wrote the guide, you mean you wrote the guide.
I wrote the guide. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely a must read if you're looking at testing your DAGs out with CI/CD. Yeah. Awesome. Take about 2 more questions here, just with the time that we have. Are there any tools you'd recommend for creating DAGs in the UI, or is this something that Airflow doesn't really support well right now?
You can't create a DAG from the UI in Airflow currently. So you have to have an actual, basically your DAG definition has to come from code that lives in this DAGs folder, is the short answer.
Yeah.
So UI is going to give you insight into what's happening with those DAGs and what they're doing and things like that, but you can't actually make changes to them currently from the UI.
Yeah, yeah. Just echoing that. I think I've seen a few plugins from various folks that have written something, but I think all it's doing is, number 1, generating a Python file in the backend, and number 2, I don't think that at least we at Astronomer haven't used any of them, so I can't say if it would fit your use case or not. I think the last question here, which is a good one to end on, is kind of as we think about dynamic DAGs and the new Airflow scheduler, are there any sort of configurations or settings that you'd recommend to think about as you are creating your dynamic DAGs and as you're kind of scaling up as you go?
Yeah, so I think I will say in general that, using Airflow 2.0 and using multiple schedulers is going to help with scalability issues, or it should, because you're sort of distributing that load to some extent. One thing to look into, and I'm not going to be able to come up with the exact name of it, but there is a parameter that controls how many tasks get queued by the scheduler. So that's something you can play around with to kind of ensure that you're making the use out of all of your scheduler replicas within 2.0, as opposed to having one scheduler do everything. So I would have to look up what it's called. I can never remember this. But I guess the short answer is yes, there are things that you can look into. You can also play around with like your scheduler heartbeat interval and things like that to kind of performance tune if you have kind of a higher scale of dynamically generated DAGs. So a couple of things to look at there, but we would highly recommend doing this with 2.0 if you can, if you're just going to have a better time in general.
Yeah, yeah, and especially when it comes to usability, make sure DAG serialization is turned on with 2.0, because otherwise your UI is going to get really slow and you're going to have to scale your web server up a lot, and you never want to be doing that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Awesome. Well, I think we're right about at time here. I know we have a bunch of questions that we didn't get a chance to get to. I'd say that's a good thing because it means we hit on a good topic. So if you would like to know more about this particular topic, please shoot us a note, and we will definitely make an effort to put out more content here. Next thing I'll always say is please register for the Airflow Summit. If this talk was interesting to you, think of talks like these, but basically 10 times as many with 10 times as many people. So we're really excited for it, and we'll send you a link to register as well if you don't know, if you haven't done so already. Yeah, that's all from my side. Thanks everyone for joining. Kenton, I'll hand it off to you for anything else that you want to say.
Yeah, I think you covered all of it. Definitely would love to have everybody sign up for the Airflow Summit. I'm going to be giving a talk there. Tons of other talks that have already been advertised that I'm super excited for. So there will be a lot of great information there. And yeah, we really appreciate everybody joining, especially everybody who's just getting back after a 3-day weekend.
Awesome. Alrighty, everyone. Thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it.